Welcome and thanks for joining us. This is the second in Center of the American Experiment's Masterclass in Public Policy series. Our speaker today is Catrin Wigfall, a policy fellow at American Experiment, focusing primarily on education. Catrin Scott taught school for 2 years in Arizona through Teach for America and worked for the Heritage Foundation and the California Policy Center before joining American Experiment. She is a summa cum laude graduate of Azusa Pacific University in California. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, all you have to do is hover over the bar at the bottom of your Zoom window and see where it says chat. If you click on that chat button, a chat box will pop up and you can ask a question or make a comment. As Catrin goes through the presentation, we may take a few questions as we go along. But in any event, there will be time for questions and answers at the end of this presentation. So you can either ask questions as we go along, or you can save them until the end. So with that, Catrin, take it away.
Thanks, John, and thank you all for joining us today. My focus throughout this presentation will be exploring how good are Minnesota's public schools really. I know education has a lot of different components, and we want to focus on the performance of our education system in the state and ask some tough questions about how we're doing in comparison to how much we spend. Given the interesting time we currently find ourselves in, our students aren't in the classrooms currently, but they most likely will be back in session come September, and I think it's important to explore what they will be returning to. Minnesotans take great pride in their education system, but are we really that good? I love bragging about Minnesota whenever I can, except for maybe about the state sports teams, but do our consistent increases in education spending have anything to show for themselves? And what we find is that unfortunately, hidden beneath our state's seemingly high rankings are educational disparities and shortcomings that have not disappeared despite decades of increased spending. But even with compelling evidence that student performance is slipping, that our achievement gap is not closing, Minnesotans still love their schools. They have great confidence in the state's education system. But I want to hear from you. What grade would you give Minnesota's public schools? You should see a poll box pop up on your screen to cast your vote now. How do you feel the state's education system is faring? See some results coming in. Okay, wow. So we see a majority of you, and I'll share the results here, see that Minnesota's public schools should get a C. And these results are not quite as optimistic as other respondents that we have asked. So through our Thinking Minnesota poll, we have found that 59% of Minnesotans would give the state's public schools an A or a B grade. And that confidence and support increases when asked about the public schools in their local community. 66% would give the schools in their local community an A or a B grade. And we see that this confidence in Minnesota's public school system is often linked to national rankings like US News and World Report and Education Week. They tend to show Minnesota's education system as being on the higher end in comparison to other states across the country. However, these popular rankings can be misleading. Research by Cato Institute reveals that these rankings don't actually provide an apples-to-apples comparison between states. They ignore student heterogeneity. They don't account for student diversity. And they also don't factor in test score results from all student groups. They look at state averages instead. So what they did then is they said, okay, we need to reassemble these rankings to include factors that should be included, such as student diversity, all scores from student groups and not just state averages. And we need to exclude factors that don't measure actual learning, such as graduation rates, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And so when we look at Minnesota's rankings, we have to consider whether or not the state's socioeconomic composition actually works in favor of the state's rankings. Minnesota is a state whose student body is nearly 65% white. And so we could do better on paper because of this. And that's because national rankings that ignore student heterogeneity and student diversity and test results from all student groups, these rankings then get skewed in favor of states with fewer socioeconomically challenged students. So when the researchers at Cato Institute reworked the state rankings, they found for Minnesota, which I'll focus on, that a state who was once ranked 7th in 2018 by US News, World and Report actually dropped to 33rd when the factors I mentioned were fully included and things like graduation rates and per pupil expenditures were excluded because those don't give us a real
Catrin, can I just stop you for a second there?
Sure.
Catrin, because I think that's kind of an interesting point. Are you saying that these US News rankings that a lot of people in Minnesota look at to say, oh boy, our schools are really good, actually count as a plus factor the dollars that you spend regardless of the results?
Some do, like Education Week's ranking, they take that into account. And what that does is states that spend more but achieve the same results as states with fewer resources get that peg up on states that spend less because they're seen as a higher spending state, and thus that must be reflected in their test scores. So there are a lot of different components that do skew these national rankings we like to point to and have a lot of confidence in. So even setting aside those state rankings, right, and talking about how they can be misleading, there are still unrelenting claims by spending advocates and the teachers union that our education woes are caused by insufficient spending. And this drives policymakers and state leaders to dedicate billions of dollars, over 40% of the state's budget, to education funding. And what this chart shows is that total revenue per pupil has consistently increased over the years. You'll notice that even the line that adjusts for inflation, even inflation adjusted spending is up 25% per pupil just since 2003. And we see even in previous years that these spending increases have been consistent, not only in Minnesota, but in other states. For the United States as a whole, we continue to spend more and more money, and unfortunately, our students are not performing at the level that they need to be successful. We also continue to appropriate more money for education spending. You can see on this chart that current education expenditure for the biennium is forecasted at $20.1 billion. That is a $1.28 billion increase over the previous biennium budget, and it is set to increase again in the next biennium. Now, in this money, it gets distributed different ways. You have teacher salaries and benefits, support services for students, transportation, but Minnesota specifically sends nearly $600 million a year directly to districts across the state to help them with low performing students who don't meet performance standards appropriate for their age. In addition, the state also gets Title I funds from the federal government for low-income students, and other state funding is also designated to work to move the achievement gap needle and help lower performing students perform better. So what this tells us is that Minnesota has multiple streams of funding going into education. Unfortunately, based on the rhetoric that we hear, there continue to be claims for more money, that this will solve our shortcomings. And even Minnesotans aren't fully sure of how much the state spends per pupil and on education in general. So there's clearly a disconnect between rhetoric and fiscal reality. With our Thinking Minnesota poll, we asked Minnesotans what their best guess was for the dollar amount that the state spends per pupil, and the median answer was $3,000, while actually the state spends around $13,000 per student each year. The map is helpful to show how Minnesota's spending per pupil compares to other states across the country. So you'll see that Minnesota is a high spending state. We're not the highest, but we do invest a lot in our education system in comparison to other states. And some numbers too for per pupil expenditures are adjusted to account for regional cost differences and cost of living, but Minnesota still remains on the higher end when those factors are included. So what do we get with more and more spending? Unfortunately, worse results. We see stagnant or declining academic outcomes and an achievement gap that just won't budge. The screen before you shows Minnesota's student performance on its state-based math assessment. And you can see that over the years, Minnesota students' math proficiency among all student groups has been declining. This is not the direction that we want our students to go. And even among reading, so this is Minnesota's state-based reading proficiency test. We see that growth among all student groups has either been stagnant or in decline over the years. And when we think about proficiency in both math and reading, we see that over 40% of Minnesota students are not proficient in either of these subjects. And it's not just limited to students of color. There are over 100,000 white students who are also not performing at grade level. So this shows that there are far too many students who are being left behind in the shadows of success. They're not performing at grade level, and they're not being given the tools that they need to succeed in the classroom. And I understand that tests are only one indicator of success. It's not the only way to measure success, but they're important because they are objective, standardized measures of student achievement on academic or proficiency standards. And they play a key role in evaluating learning. I also think that tests are important to look at because they can assert healthy pressure to keep schools on target and students on the same general trajectory. We need to have some way to measure where students are at and where we want them to be. Now, aside from Minnesota's state-based tests, Minnesota students also take what's called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or the nation's report card. And this is the only assessment that can be used to compare students across the nation and between states. I do not use Minnesota's state-based tests to make this comparison because Minnesota's state-based tests have its own objectives and standards, and they're not comparable to other state-based tests. The nation's report card, though, is because it is administered to students across the country in the same way, and it's also federally required by law to participate. So on these national tests, you can see that Minnesota students have also declined in both reading and mathematics, in 4th grade and 8th grade in both subject areas. The dashed lines on the chart, those are the proficiency marks for each grade level and subject area tested. Now, as I previously mentioned, these test results are helpful to compare Minnesota students' performance relative to students in other states.
Hey, Catrin, can I just pause you for a minute here and make sure, I just want to take a minute to give everybody a chance to look at this chart and make sure that we all understand it. So what we're looking at here, each line represents what, the average for all Minnesota kids taking the test?
Correct, in that grade level and for that specific subject area.
So we see 4th grade math, 4th grade reading, 8th grade math, and 8th grade reading. And to me anyway, Catrin, what jumps out at me is that all 4 of those lines are trending downward between 2013 and 2019. In other words, on the average, Minnesota's kids are scoring worse rather than better in all 4 of those, at all 4 of those measurement points. Is that right?
That is correct. So not only on our state-based tests, but also when we have our students test on national assessments, we're seeing this very worrisome decline in student performance. And the reason that there are gap years on this chart is because this national test is administered every 2 years. So even within that 2-year time period, students are still losing progress in these subject areas and not making the gains that they need to. And even for most of these subject areas, Minnesota students' performance below the proficiency standard is still not that impressive. And then pair that with the declining scores makes me really worried about whether or not we're doing a good job setting our students up for success.
So what this would indicate, if I'm reading it right, is that in all 4 of these areas, with the possible exception of the 4th grade math scores, a majority of Minnesota's public school students are not reaching the level that's defined as proficient by the federal standards. Is that correct?
That is correct. And these are a benchmark measurement, and so they are a higher standard than some of the state-based tests. But again, students are not reaching that mark, and because scores are declining, not improving, that sets me up for even more worry.
And Katja, we have a good question here from one of our viewers. Is the dashed line the national average? And I think the answer is no, it's not necessarily the national average, but it's what's defined by the federal government as what a student ought to be able to score to be considered proficient, whether it's reading or math. Is that right?
Correct. Yes, yes. And I know it might be a bit confusing. It's so for each grade level and subject area, there's a different measure of what's proficient. And so that's why the dashed lines are there, because the average scale score for fourth grade math proficiency is not the same as the average scale score for fourth grade reading proficiency. And so that's why each line has its own dashed mark. Now, to the point about the national average, there are certain subject areas and grade levels where Minnesota is above the national average. That is accurate. However, when we see the national average compared to Minnesota as far as improving or declining, we still should be worried that Minnesota's scores are on the decline, on a downward trend versus an upward trend, especially in comparison to other states who either performed below the national average in previous years and are now either at par or above, and states that are above the national average and continue to go above the national average. Good question. So as I mentioned, we're going to use these scores to measure Minnesota's performance in comparison to other states. And the reason that this is helpful is because we know how much Minnesota spends per pupil, and these are the test results that come from it. But what about other states and their spending? Do states who spend more money per pupil do better on this national assessment? Do states who spend less money do worse? And I think some of the results may surprise you. So take a look at this first example. This is a comparison of Minnesota's scores on the national test compared to Mississippi's scores. Note the difference in per pupil expenditure that each state spends. Mississippi spends less than Minnesota does per student. And what's interesting is when you compare students of color in Mississippi, whose student body is made up of almost 49% of Black students compared to Minnesota's nearly 11%, Mississippi has better performance than our state among students of color. In fact, as you can see from the chart, Mississippi Black and Hispanic students outperformed Minnesota Black and Hispanic students in each subject test for each grade level. So Mississippi is serving more students from socioeconomically challenged backgrounds, and they're doing a better job of helping them grow academically than we are here in Minnesota with our own students of color. Equally important is that Mississippi's scores on the national test for Black students have been going up over the years compared to Minnesota's declining scores for its Black student body. So Minnesota white students, interestingly enough, did outperform Mississippi's white students by a little bit, but even among low-income students, of which Mississippi has 75% compared to Minnesota's 37%, Mississippi's low-income fourth graders ranked third in the nation in reading. Minnesota's ranked 40th. So there's clearly something going on in Mississippi. We tend to look down on Mississippi at times as a state, but when it comes to serving its low-income students and helping them grow academically every year, Mississippi is clearly doing something right, and they're figuring it out with far less money. Let's also take a look at Texas, a state that serves similar student demographics as Minnesota, but spends far less to do so. As the chart shows, Texas Black, Hispanic, and Asian students outperformed Minnesota Black, Hispanic, and Asian students on each 2019 national test for each subject area and grade level. So again, we see another example of a state who spends less but is achieving better results, especially when it comes to their students of color. So these examples show that assuming that Minnesota must do a better job educating its students because it spends more money is simply not accurate. So I've acknowledged that we have lackluster academic outcomes, but we also have one of the worst achievement gaps in the country. And this disparity is not just limited between white and Black students or by race, but it's also evident between low-income students and students who are better off. These six line graphs that you see here show different ways to close the achievement gap or try to shrink the achievement gap. And if you look at these graphs, I think it's pretty easy to spot there's only one way to properly narrow the gap that is good for all students. And that's this one circled right here. That is when the average scores of both groups are increasing, with the scores of the lower performing students increasing at a higher rate to close the gap. The other ways of showing a gap shrinkage or talking about that the gap has narrowed result in either higher performing students' scores declining, scores staying stagnant in both groups, or both scores declining. And this does not benefit all students, and it should not be how we look to close the achievement gap. Unfortunately, in Minnesota, as we try to close our stubborn achievement gap, sometimes we talk about how that gap has shrunk. And in some cases it hasn't, and in some cases it has. However, we need to look at what it means when we say that the gap has shrunk. So take a look at this chart. This shows student proficiency in 3rd grade based on Minnesota's state-based reading assessment. And if you look at the percentages of student proficiency for white students and Black students in 2019, compared to the proficiency of white students and Black students in 2015, it's obvious that the percentage gap between the two groups has shrunk. However, just because it is smaller does not mean that it is benefiting all students. This is a bad gap closure because it is mainly due to declining proficiency of white students. We don't want to see one group scores decline and very little growth you can see here by our Black students in order to close that gap.
Hey, Catrin, can I just interrupt you with a quick question here?
Yes.
You know, we've in Minnesota, and I'm sure it's true in a lot of other states as well, we have heard a huge amount of talk in the last few years about this achievement gap. And it tends to focus on white and Black students, although, you know, you could look at Hispanic students, you could look at Asian students, you could do it in terms of income instead of race. But for whatever reason, the focus tends to be on the disparity between white students and Black students. And there's a constitutional amendment that is being proposed now and has got some very powerful backers. And the idea of this constitutional amendment, which would simply decree that every kid in Minnesota is entitled to a quality education, you know, darn it, somehow is going to magically do away with this very stubborn achievement gap. I know this isn't really in your presentation, but could you just take a minute to comment on that? Is there any reason to believe that amending our Constitution is somehow gonna cause this gap to disappear?
The short answer is no. And while I applaud that the conversation is started, because this is obviously something the state has struggled with for decades, these numbers go way beyond what I'm showing on my charts. By changing some language, you cannot ensure that students are getting the quality education that they deserve. And while the amendment proposal sounds good on paper, it actually places the education system into the hands of courts. And we are left with figuring out, well, who defines what a quality education is? We already have these standards and expectations that students must reach. So why will changing some words help us make the change that is obviously so needed? So that's a short answer, but it is clearly not something that can change by a constitutional amendment. And I think there are many people who agree with that, and I'm happy to have that conversation further along the road on a different platform and in a different space to talk about how the amendment proposal would actually hurt students more than it would help them. And I actually have my own ideas of how to turn things around in Minnesota's education system so that we can make meaningful change to close the gap and better serve all students. So happy to, if any other thoughts on that?
No, that's good. Thanks, Catrin.
All right. So we've looked at how, we have these lackluster academic outcomes. We have one of the worst achievement gaps in the country. We've talked about how this disparity is not limited to race. But what about rising graduation rates? Sometimes this has been referenced as a positive. Oh, look, Minnesota is graduating more students. So does that show that we are improving? And this goes back to what I first said earlier about how mentioning graduation rates and state rankings can actually skew those rankings because graduation rates don't measure actual learning. For instance, to get a high school diploma in Minnesota, a certain number of credits in core courses is required. Notice I said credits. High school credits are often given based on class hours rather than demonstration of proficiency in or mastery of subject area. And in 2013, Minnesota's legislature removed required minimum test scores for a high school graduation diploma. And that's noted by the red dashed line on the chart. And what this did is it diluted graduation requirements and allowed students who don't demonstrate proficiency to still graduate because they obtained the necessary course credits and hours. So while our graduation rates may be increasing, it should give us pause given the decline in test scores and given an analysis of our college readiness tests that shows that an increasing proportion of the students we are graduating are unprepared for college and other post-secondary options. So the more we spend, we've seen the worse our students are doing on tests, both state-based and national. And even though we are graduating more students, they aren't best set up for future success. So where does that leave us? Where do we go from here? If insufficient money isn't the problem, then what is? Well, according to Minnesotans, discipline is a huge factor. Our Thinking Minnesota poll discovered that the top response from Minnesotans on what problem is the greatest that faces Minnesota's public schools is discipline. Students who are undisciplined and disruptive and demonstrate a violence and paired with a lack of school safety. We have racial quotas in our discipline policies, and what that does is it leaves teachers and students in chaotic classrooms where safety is a concern and learning is disrupted. And this really has been found to be a non-political, non-partisan issue. We have heard from teachers across all ideologies that the administration doesn't stand up for them, the teachers union doesn't support them, they don't feel protected because they can't suspend students or even have them removed from the classroom for disruptive behavior. And students are being attacked or teachers are being attacked by students, and they can't do anything about it. Their hands are tied behind their backs. And so it's unfortunate that this is the case, because how do we expect to improve our academic outcomes and make sure that all students are able to learn in a safe environment without disruptions if teachers cannot discipline students and hold them accountable for their behavior? So what can we do? Where do we go from here?
Hey, Catrin, could I just interrupt you for a moment? Because one of our viewers makes a really good comment talking about this issue of, to me, it just is insane that we actually have situations in this state or any state where a student will assault a teacher, sometimes beating up a teacher severely in the classroom without even being suspended from school. I mean, it's unbelievable that this is happening, but it is happening. And one of our viewers comments, yeah, thanks to the threatened lawsuit by the Minnesota Department of Human Rights. And that's right. And maybe just take a minute, if you would, Catrin, to explain what this viewer is talking about and what a terrible, terrible effect that has had on Minnesota schools.
Sure, yes. The Minnesota Department of Human Rights sent out letters to 43 districts and charter schools threatening to sue them over their suspension numbers, because they claimed that the suspension numbers had great racial disparities, and therefore they wanted to adjust that to make sure the students of color weren't being suspended at higher rates than the proportion that they made up within the student body. Well, at the end of the day, student behavior should be accountable regardless of the race of the student. And while a lot of school districts caved and made an agreement with the Department of Human Rights to address this problem, some didn't. And the problem, though, is that by putting these racial quotas on discipline issues, it is causing teachers to have to turn their face the other way and not look at disruptive behavior, or take a physical attack and not be able to do anything out of concern for being called a racist or for picking on students of color or that sort of thing, instead of having it be about the student, regardless of skin color, and being held responsible for the behavior that is being demonstrated. We do our students such a great disservice if we don't hold them accountable for their behavior, because when they get out of the classroom, actions have consequences, and I would hate to have a child end up in a prison pipeline or something of that nature because their actions and their behavior in the classroom wasn't properly handled. So that's the short answer to what the Department of Human Rights has done. And school districts now, because of that, are afraid of getting slapped with a lawsuit and are working on what they call restorative justice practices and that sort of thing to avoid suspending students and to avoid expelling students so that their numbers don't appear out of order according to the Department of Human Rights. So with that, it's obviously an issue that factors into learning environments and how students are able to engage with the material before them and how they even feel in school as far as the safety goes. So where do we go from here? We have performed the money experiment. We've seen that over the years, spending more money on education hasn't resulted in meaningful change, both in test scores and in the achievement gap. And continuing to throw more money at a broken system is just bad policy. So here are 3 proposals to explore. The first proposal is something the center has talked about for many, many years, and that's expanding the school choice continuum. And when we talk about school choice, though, we want it to include real school choice, which includes religious and private schools. Too many students are bound to a school that is failing them and not meeting their needs. And whether it's financial barriers or transportation issues, they are not able to get into a different learning environment that will help them succeed. I also think that we need to restore discipline in classrooms and remove racial quotas. As I mentioned before, we do students a disservice by not holding them accountable for their behavior. And if we hope to improve our academic outcomes, how can we expect students to learn in an environment that is chaotic and that doesn't work to benefit all students because a couple of students are acting out and are unable to be dismissed from class until they calm down and get their behavior in order? We also put teachers in harm's way by not removing these racial quotas and not trusting them with their classroom and with classroom management. Why we put them in harm's way when students can attack them and do not get suspended. And I wish the teachers union would do more to support teachers and step up, but unfortunately they turn the cheek a lot of times, as we've seen with former teacher Erin Benner, and they do not stand up for teachers in the way that teachers deserve, and they don't stand up for students, those who are left in the classroom with learning disrupted and who do not feel safe because the disobedient students are not excused or removed. I also think we need to look to what has worked in other states. I mentioned Mississippi, and Mississippi is obviously doing something right to help their students of color and their low-income students improve academically. Does this mean that Mississippi is nirvana? No, of course not. Their education system still has its own kinks to work out. And this doesn't mean that Minnesota is doing everything wrong. But Mississippi clearly has something figured out when it can spend its dollars more effectively, get more bang for its education buck, and help its students of color improve their test scores over the years and reach those levels of proficiency that will help set them up for success in future grades. And Mississippi has done this in one way is by focusing on reading literacy programs and making sure that its teachers understand the science of reading instruction. And so it's focused funds on reading instruction in particular, and that has paid off. It's more important to figure out how to spend your money effectively than how much you have to spend. And Mississippi has shown through the national tests that they have figured it out, and it's paid off. Mississippi was the only state in the nation to post significant gains on the fourth grade national reading test. And fourth graders now in Mississippi are reading on par with the national average, and they're even reading as well or better than students in 21 other states. So again, it's clear they are doing more to help their students of color, their low-income students. They have more of them to work with in Minnesota. So we can take a lesson or two from their reading approach and figure out how we can apply that to help our students do better as well. So with this though, there should be one key takeaway that we know. Pouring more money into our public school system has not resulted in improved academic outcomes or meaningful progress in closing the achievement gap. I recognize that currently our students are participating in distance learning, so it'll be really interesting to see how this time learning at home will shake up the education system. Will violence be considered more so now because students are home and they're safe? Will some parents realize that homeschooling may be right for their student? Will some parents want their child to get back into the classroom, but maybe it's a classroom setting in a different school than the traditional public school? Regardless, I think when students do return to the classroom, and even now, we really need to start holding our state accountable for the taxpayer money that's been invested into education and ask, where are the results of all our spending? We're doing a disservice to too many students by not asking these tough questions, by being allergic to accountability. And I think that it's time to figure this out and really nail in and nail down on what we can do to make sure that all Minnesota students are prepared and ready for the next step in their futures. So thank you for your attention, and I welcome any questions.
Hey, that was just great, Catrin. And we've had a steady stream of questions and comments throughout the presentation. A lot of them very, very interesting. And if you have been holding off until now to ask a question or make a comment, now's the time. Go ahead and type it in. In the meantime, I want to toss some questions that we've been getting here over the last few minutes to Catrin. One question that we've gotten from, or comment that we've gotten from a number of people is along the lines of, why is it that we have low performing demographics and so on? And isn't the real problem one parent families, lack of discipline at home, et cetera? And there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, Mitch Pearlstein, who founded our organization for 30 years, has written about those issues. And I don't think there's any doubt that if you want to look for a root cause of why a lot of kids have got terrible problems in school, the root cause doesn't necessarily lie in the school. It probably lies in the family. And not having a two-parent family is just kind of a fundamental, reality. But let me give my answer first, Catrin, and then bounce it to you for your answer. I think the point that these commenters make is correct. There's no denying it. But that said, it doesn't mean that kids who come from problematic backgrounds, one-parent families, low income, et cetera, are a lost cause. It doesn't mean that that's hopeless. And in fact, we see that there are some states that are doing a better job with at-risk populations. And so I guess what I would say is we can't give up on this big chunk of our youth. We got to try to figure out. We understand our issues that didn't necessarily start in the school, but nevertheless, some states are doing a better job of working with these kids. So, Catrin, that's my answer. What do you think about that?
No, I agree. And there has been, a lot of research done over the years to examine that association between family structure and children's educational achievement. And reports have shown that combined GPA in math and reading that GPA is higher among students from intact two-parent married households, even compared to single families who were once married but now divorced. But to your point, I agree. Well, the home environment does play a role, and there are obviously factors in home environments that are outside of school and teachers' control. We can't give up on these students, and we can't give school districts a pass for not working better with these students and figuring out what works, what other states have done to help them succeed. I think about my own teaching background. I taught at a Title I school, which served predominantly low-income families. Some of them were from two-parent households. Some of them were from single mother households. Some of them were divorced parents. And when I think about those students and the challenges that they overcome at home, in the classroom, when they are given the right tools, they can succeed. They can overcome those socioeconomic barriers, and I held them all to the same expectations and the same standards and saw them achieve greatness. And so I agree that it's unfortunate that students have to bring this baggage to schools. It was very challenging to have to see students come to school hungry, and I would keep snacks in my cabinet to feed them. But when it comes to their desire to learn, their understanding of the expectations before them, that they are held to personal responsibility and high standards regardless, even a lot of the single parent families that I worked with, they wanted their child to succeed. They knew their child had other barriers to overcome and that they couldn't always offer the support that intact families could provide. But there was hope there, and I'm confident that those students that I taught are now continuing on in these future grades with that mindset still in place that they can succeed and overcome those external factors.
Hey, Catrin, I don't want to embarrass you here, but I think it's worth mentioning that when you were with Teach for America, which is what you were just talking about there, you were in Arizona teaching elementary school kids who were mostly Hispanic and mostly poor, and among other things, you taught them Latin, right? And you know, your experience was that the kids could learn if you held them to a high standard and maintained discipline in the classroom. You know, sure enough, these kids could learn, right?
They could. And I remember on curriculum night explaining to these parents that I was going to teach their child Latin. I got a lot of eyebrow raises, like, why is this going to help my student? But at the end of the year, students really felt empowered learning the language. As you mentioned, a majority of them were Hispanic and native Spanish speakers. So the connections that they made with Spanish, Latin roots and Spanish words, and it actually helped with their English and their grammar. And so yes, they mastered Latin. They took it despite the external factors that they were dealing with. And I think it helps set them up for success, not only as learning a language, but also in other areas like English and grammar, sentence structure, that sort of thing.
One of our viewers asked a really interesting question, which is, well, what if we just made all education private? You know, in the old days, education was private, and then public education came along in the United States, what I guess in the 19th century, and was viewed as a great step forward. And you've written, Catrin, about the school system in New Orleans, which after Hurricane Katrina, they didn't go private, but they went charter in a way that's pretty similar to going private. Talk about that a little bit, if you would.
Sure. So New Orleans is unique because they obviously had a hurricane that disrupted their entire school system and destroyed a majority of the school buildings and left a lot of students without a classroom. And so because of this emergency, the state stepped in and basically created a system of all charter schools. They were in a position to create charter schools and run them this way because the public schools were destroyed. And what came about is that while New Orleans students, you know, still have work to do to compete academically with the rest of the country, the progress that they made after the system was switched to charter schools was remarkable. There was more accountability, more autonomy, and these are predominantly students from low-income backgrounds and from communities of color. So New Orleans really kind of gave us a model that to look to, not saying that it's worth exactly replicating in every state because every state is different, but they did show us that you can completely change a school system and change who controls it, and students will benefit. And to this day, a huge majority of New Orleans students still attend charter schools.
Let's see, several of our viewers have mentioned the role of the teachers union, Education Minnesota, the dominant force, obviously, in public education. We could have a whole nother webinar devoted to nothing but the baleful influence of the teachers' unions. But talk about that a little bit, if you would. In other words, you laid out some reforms that the state ought to be making. School choice, which Mitch Pearlstein has been fighting for 30 years, real school choice. We can't get it. Talk a little bit, if you would, Catrin, about the role that the union plays here.
Well, the union would look at my proposals and others I've written about and be completely against all of them. And that is because it would take power away from them and control away from them. And it would limit the control that they have not only over teachers, but over classrooms. And what I have read is that the teachers union answer to fixing our disparities is we need to fully fund public schools. And Education Minnesota President Denise Specht has said, well, in order to fully fund our schools, Minnesota needs to spend $4 billion more every 2 years, and then our shortcomings will disappear. And my response to that is, if there was a magic number that would fix educational disparities and shortcomings, wouldn't we already be spending that or looking to spend that? We have shown, my charts have shown that more spending is not the answer. So the union, I think, is not on the right track as far as solutions go, saying that we just need to spend more money and that will fix the problems. Even with classroom discipline, I mentioned there are teachers that have tried standing up to these racial quotas and discipline policies, and the union has not supported them. And so how can the union say that they are for teachers and for kids when they are content with the status quo, and when they don't want to explore other options that would actually help students be set up for success and get out of the failing school systems that the union so adamantly defends?
You know, a number of our commenters have asked questions and made comments in different ways, but with a similar theme. Some have asked, well, are there schools that do a lot better than other schools? And for example, one of our viewers comments, Hope Academy in Minneapolis. And by the way, Hope Academy sends kids to, I think, all of our events. They will always have a teacher chaperone, and they'll have a table of, 10 kids or so. And I think every event we have, Hope Academy will send some kids to. So this commenter says, Hope Academy in Minneapolis spends less per student and gets much better results than Minneapolis schools. The public schools can learn from Hope. I think that's right. I mean, in general, charter schools and private schools, they don't spend more, they spend less per pupil. Can you comment on that? What are some examples of schools that we already have here in Minnesota that you're aware of that are kind of showing the way in terms of educational improvement?
No, Hope Academy is definitely up there. Providence Academy. There are several charter schools and even certain school districts. I mean, Minnetonka had to cap its enrollment because of open enrollment. They had so many students fleeing other traditional neighborhood school districts to come to them. So this is by no means to say that there aren't school districts and certain schools within districts that have figured it out or are making meaningful progress that we can learn from. But to your point about tuition, that yes, Hope Academy's tuition is far less than what Minneapolis spends per student. Minneapolis Public Schools reports that their per pupil expenditures are maybe $16,000, $17,000 per student. I believe that is not accurate, and my next project will be to create a website that breaks down what districts report they spend per pupil and what they actually spend. Minneapolis is closer to $19,000, $20,000, even over $20,000 per student, depending on what factors you include. So yes, private schools, charter schools, they all cost less to educate a student. And the claims, though, that public school students who leave their traditional public school to go to, say, Hope Academy, that takes money away from public schools, the money follows the child. So yes, the public school doesn't get that per pupil dollar amount because for that student body that's not in the classroom. But that student also takes with them other expenses that the school has to divvy out, that it now can maybe even save because that student is no longer there. So it's an argument that we consistently hear. But again, there are schools doing things right, and we need to celebrate those schools and learn from them rather than demonize them, because the schools that aren't serving students well are getting a whole lot more money to have these low academic results. And a lot of families are fed up, and we see them fleeing Minneapolis and St. Paul public schools in search of a better learning environment. And I think the state of Minnesota can do far more to open up other learning environments for families to access, and break down financial barriers. Governor Walz talks a lot about how no student should be bound to a school based on his or her zip code. Well, that's true, but you also have to think of the financial barriers in place. And what if the surrounding zip codes aren't even that great? Where does the student go? So yes, I agree that there are schools doing a great job, and we need to explore those further, and celebrate that and learn from them.
One of our viewers has some information here. I'm assuming he's right. This is something I had not heard about. I don't know, Catrin, if it's familiar to you or not, but he says, FYI, the new St. Paul school/union agreement prevents St. Paul from starting any new charter schools. Do you know anything about that, Catrin? That's news to me.
I know there was a talk of putting a moratorium on charter schools in St. Paul, and I'm not sure whether or not that actually went through. Based on the comment, maybe it did, and I'll need to explore that. But I know there was talk of it, which is unfortunate because St. Paul needs to figure out why its enrollment numbers are declining and why they're losing families to charter schools and surrounding schools. There's a reason for it. And so if that moratorium came through, it's going to do a great disservice to a lot of low income and families of color in St. Paul who are fed up that the St. Paul public schools aren't serving their students.
You know, one of our commenters makes the same point you just made, Catrin. He says, Minneapolis and St. Paul public schools have been bleeding students the last few years. Parents are awakening to charter school choices. I think that's exactly what you just said. I think it's precisely correct. And of course, the teachers union hates charter schools. And so if they've actually negotiated a contract term that will prevent the establishment of any new charter schools in St. Paul, that's just one more way in which the teachers union is working in a way that is adverse to the interests of students.
Mm-hmm. And to comment too on the moratorium on charter schools, if that's being done because the teachers union is claiming that St. Paul is losing students and money to these other schools, well, let's talk about the union's contract proposal that they negotiated and the spending increases that they wanted the school district to do there, not only in wages and salaries and wages for the teachers, but they wanted a district who is already in the red to go even further in the red. And so it's not just students taking funds with them to get to better schools. It's also the demands that the union is placing on the school district and its contract proposals. It wants more money for teachers, and while wage increases for teachers can be discussed and negotiated, the union is not upfront with those dollar amounts and what that actually means for pay increases and the financial burden that it would place on, as I said, a district that's already $10 million in red at least, and struggling to figure out what to do because they're losing students.
One of our viewers makes a comment that I've heard many, many times. I'll be curious to get your bounce on it, Catrin. He says, private schools do not need to deal with the students that don't want to learn. Public schools have no choice but to take all. What are your thoughts on that?
I'd be curious what they meant by that. I think what they mean is that private schools don't have to accept enrollment papers from all students. There's the argument that public schools get more of the special ed students and that sort of thing than private schools. But from my own experience, there are rules and things in place that at least the school that I taught at, the charter school that I taught at, had to follow, where you can't just deny a student just to deny them. We had to go through paperwork and that sort of thing. And I don't know, I struggled to understand that argument, because you're going to have disruptive students in any learning environment, but there are private schools maybe have more support in place, or they are allowed.
Let's distinguish here, though, Catrin. I mean, charter schools are public schools, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're taxpayer supported. They're part of a public school system, a relatively small part. I mean, private schools, if you're talking about Blake or Breck or St. Paul Academy, yeah, they get a totally different student body for obvious reasons than any of the public schools. But in the data that you've been laying out here, where if we compare Minnesota to Mississippi, Minnesota to Texas, everything we're talking about there is public schools, right?
Correct. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I think it's true that there are some private schools, not all. I mean, there are a lot of private religious schools, for example, that are not elite, selective schools like, Breck or Blake or something like that. But certainly there are some private schools that are able to get a totally different, student body. But that's not the comparison that you're doing, just so we're clear. Isn't that right?
Right. No, and the public school student body demographics that I'm comparing show that Minnesota has to work with fewer students from challenging backgrounds than a state like Mississippi, and yet we still see Mississippi helping them grow academically. So I'd be curious to hear what the respondent has to say about that, because it's not like Mississippi is working with a small portion of Black students or a small portion of low-income students, and they're kind of then they can give them the more individualized support and that sort of thing. No, this is nearly half of their student body. For low-income students, it's 3/4 of their student body. And so they've figured out a way to help these students grow. And Minnesota, with a majority, 65% of its student body who is white, they have fewer socioeconomically challenged students to work with than some other states who are seeing gains and are doing so at far less the cost than what Minnesota is.
Catrin, a couple of our commenters have asked questions about comparing schools in Minnesota in different ways, and in at least one instance, urban versus rural. I don't know if you've broken down the numbers this way, but if we look at Minnesota's schools in like sort of three broad categories: rural schools, greater Minnesota schools, suburban schools, and urban schools. Can you comment at all on what you see in terms of achievement levels if you look at those three categories?
Well, I was just recently looking at the top 35 low performing schools in Minnesota, and a good chunk of them are from, I want to say it was like 8 out of 35 are from Minneapolis, 10 out of 35 are from St. Paul, so about half are from Minneapolis and St. Paul alone. But other schools listed are from these smaller districts in rural Minnesota, and are still struggling to help minority students improve academically. Now, there is also the argument that, the Twin Cities area and the Metro County, they have higher proportions of these students, which is true. But again, it goes back to looking at other states that work with even higher proportions of these students and help them make significant achievement gains.
Well, we're bumping up here against the 1 o'clock hour, so I think this is time to call a halt. Catrin, thank you so much. I thought that was just terrific. And thank you to all of our viewers and participants. We had really lively conversation here going on in the comments and questions. And we didn't get to all the questions, but thank you to everybody who participated.
Thanks, John. Thank you all.